Everybody, good evening. Everybody. Kenneth told me you are, quote, an unruly bunch, and so I come to order. I'm Stephen Bourne. I'm the Dean of the Faculty of Law at Monash. Delighted to be here. Very grateful to the firm for having us this evening, meeting as we are on the unceded lands of the people of the Kulin Nations. Pay my respects to elders past and present. Extend those respects to all our First Nations guests. I have a number of jobs tonight, and I'll try and make sure I do them all in the proper order. First, to welcome you all, and a special welcome to Ruth, Bob's wife. It was very celebrated, very special night. My great thanks to Jennifer for bringing everyone together. What a special legacy Bob has. I didn't have the privilege of knowing him, but I have been reading this book, which some of you may have seen before. This is Pericles and Plumbers and Practitioners, which is a history of the first 50 years of Monash Law Faculty. It is full of gossip, which I enjoy greatly. Tonight we will talk about Bob's legacy in terms of commercial law and commercial contributions, but there is so much in here. Bob set up the Monash University Law Review, which I did not know. He set up the Alumni Association, which I did not know. He advocated, which I love, for jurisprudence and legal history to be a fundamental part, a requirement of the law degree. Sadly, that did not pass. I'm told that when people did well, he would send around notes to the faculty celebrating articles and books that have been published, great successes. And one time he did this, the book says, in an interview with Bob, he says, let's send around a note. And I said, we've done really well. We are now the leading law school in Australia. And the dean of Melbourne Law School wrote to him and said, Bob, cut the crap. And made me smile. So thank you all for being here so much. It's a very special evening. I'm delighted to be a very small part of it. Again, our great thanks to the firm for their generosity, which is very much appreciated. And over to Rebecca. Thank you.
Thanks, Stephen. It's my job to say a few words about Bob and what a wonderful man he was and how much we miss him. And that is very easy because he was very wonderful indeed. I still remember the excitement at our firm, Freehills at the time, when the kind of secret squirrels, we've got this new amazing partner joining us, but we could not believe our luck that it was the great Bob Baxt, who was already beyond famous at that time. And we were lucky enough to have him spend many years as a partner of our firm. One of the things that really struck me about Bob, you get some super smart people who know they're super smart, and then you get some super smart people who just see the greatness in everybody else. And that was Bob. So he was always telling me about his latest, graduate who was working on the team and just how incredibly intelligent they were. And of course, those graduates found him so inspiring. Many women of our firm, including myself, were actively supported by Bob, and several female partners of our firm now will say that it was actually career-changing, the attention that he showed to getting them exposure as well, which was a really wonderful thing that he did. Now, he was always with his partner in crime, but Ruth, Bob had many interests, corporations, competition law. I'm sure he would have been intensely interested in the reputational topic this evening. He would have had views. But Ruth had the joy of going with him each of the workshops and actually sitting through the sessions, which was far more dedicated than my husband ever was at any of the corporations workshops, where he was off at the beach while we were doing the boring thing, but Ruth was there absolutely supporting him. And Ruth, we're so delighted that you could join us tonight. I just want to say we really do miss Bob. He was always full of energy, full of ideas, full of enthusiasm and excitement. And I have heard a couple of other things I didn't even know that he had done this evening. But as you know, his role at the ACCC, the Law Council, the Corporations Committee, the Competition Committee, there are so many things that he actually pushed for, started, and had key roles in. It was amazing. But I do just want to come back to what really struck me the most, and even chatting with several of you before this afternoon, he just personally influenced so many of us, and so many of us have a really special place in our heart for Bob. So thank you, Jennifer, for driving this wonderful panel in his honour. I'm sure he would be beyond delighted, and he'd be saying what a wonderful person you are and how super smart you are. But we know that as well. So with that, I'll hand over to our fabulous Hal.
Now, can I just check, Ruth, can you hear us at this point? Can we hear you? I can hear you. Fantastic. Good. And we can hear you as well. It's all good news. So we've got a few mics here and we are recording. So I'm just thrilled to be here. I'm thrilled to be here with Ruth, who I've known for many, many years, and Rebecca talking about Bob's legacy in that way. I just remember being a very young single parent with a 4-year-old who wrote an article that Bob clearly read. And then he said, you should come along to one of our corporate law business council workshops. And I thought, what? Me? You know? And from that moment on, that's how I met many of you. And, you know, that was the kind of supportive person that Bob was. I also, and Ruth knows this story, I can't remember whether I told it when we had another event earlier in Bob's honour, but I bumped into Ruth and Bob in the middle of the Metropolitan Museum in New York on my first ever trip to America and my first ever sabbatical, and said 4-year-old kind of ran off, and I said, Professor Baxt, Mrs. Baxt, hello. And Bob said, what are you doing in America, Jennifer? You know, what are the chances, you know? And so I said, I'm going on my first ever sabbatical to Duke University, Professor Baxt. And then this guy kept coming over to me and saying, ma'am, your daughter is trying to jump into the Canal of Dendu. Could you please control your child? And I couldn't leave Bob and Ruth. So I just thought, Sophia, you've the Canal of Dendu. That's it, you know. So I too really want to thank Herbert Smith Freehills Kramer and Rebecca for hosting this event. I phoned Rebecca and I said, look, I've just got this idea rattling around in my head. I just wondered, you know, your firm wouldn't be interested in hosting it, would you? And literally within an hour, I think I'd heard from your amazing client services team in Melbourne. And, you know, Rebecca just said, of course we want to host it. So special thanks not only to Rebecca, but also to Christine and Yaz, who have been amazing in planning this. When I spoke to Ruth about this particular event, she said Bob will be there in spirit. I know that's true, Ruth, and I know that this is absolutely up his alley. He would have just relished, you know, the ideas and this incredible panel. So let me tell you about this incredible panel of total underachievers. So first of all, we've got Ruth Higgins, who's joining us from Sydney. It's Ruth Higgins Senior Counsel. Ruth is a graduate of Oxford University, and also she hails from Scotland. And she's one of the leading, well, you know, possibly the leading commercial silk in a wide range of areas that were Bob's pet areas. She practices nationally in so many areas that were close to Bob's heart, such as competition law, class actions, corporations law, just to name a few. She's been involved in a number of major public inquiries and commissions in Australia. She is a member of the Takeovers Panel. She's a visiting fellow of the Julius Stone Institute at the University of Sydney. She's a fellow of the Australian Academy of Law, and she's Assistant General Editor of the Australian Law Journal. And she regularly appears as one of the best lawyers in Australia. And in her spare time, she writes books. And I see you've got a new one coming out, I think, Ruth, called Law's Candour. Is that right? Well done, you.
At some point.
Carmel is sitting here to my left. Carmel Mulhern. We're very fortunate because we have Carmel as one of our members of the CLARS Advisory Board. So we get to see Carmel on a regular basis and to speak to her. She's a global executive leader and she's been an advisor to boards and CEOs in a wide range of sectors, so financial services, telecommunications, media, technology. She also held senior positions at Telstra, where she worked with Deputy Director of CLARS, Steve Carabas, who's there and going to take photos, aren't you, Steve?
Alongside.
Yes. And Carmel was Group General Counsel of the Commonwealth Bank up until 2023. She's now an independent non-executive director of PwC Australia and holds a number of other positions. And she also writes books. You know, I haven't written that many books, but all you people that do other things, you're always writing books. She's a member of Chief Executive Women, a fellow of the Governance Institute, graduate of AICD, and most importantly, a graduate of Monash University Law School, her master's degree. And so that is Carmel. And then our visitor, who valiantly on Tuesday night gave a killer presentation to us on specialist directors a few hours after he stepped off a flight from America. Last Friday, I was told he doesn't have a visa for Australia yet. We don't know if he's coming. So that was really a fun afternoon with me talking to politicians in America, not in America, but in Canberra, and then it came through the next day. So I'm hoping that was because of my conversations with them, Roy. So we're so glad. We've got Roy here for a week. One of the people at the Tuesday night event said to me, "Can't you get him out for 6 months?" And I suggested that to him. So we'll talk about that later. So Roy is currently a senior visiting fellow at Harvard Law School's program on corporate governance. His normal job is a professor at Reichman University in Israel. He's a graduate of Harvard Law School. He's taught at Harvard Economics Department and UC Berkeley Law. And he's a prolific scholar, and he writes on this very area. He writes on reputational concerns, corporate governance and corporate law litigation. He had a book in 2020 with Cambridge University Press, which was on, the connection between legal and reputational risks. And he's consulted with corporate boards on that issue. And he's got a number of papers that are making waves in the US and Europe as we speak. So I couldn't think of a better panel to discuss this issue of corporate reputation. And we're going to dive right into it. Where they're not doing kind of prepared pieces, so this could really go anywhere. But I'm just going to throw out some questions and we're going to see where we go. We're going to have time for questions from you guys at the end of the presentation or the discussion. So please don't forget those ideas. Write them down, put them on your phone if you think you're going to forget them by the end. And we're going to start because, I just want to talk about this issue of what is corporate reputation. And back in 1997, the two founders of the Reputation Institute in the US said not very many people talk about this issue. That was before, of course, Roy wrote his book. And they said that's because it covers so many different disciplines, it's just very hard to pin down. And those founders of the Reputation Institute said nobody talks about it until reputation is threatened. And we've seen so many threats to corporate reputation, both in the US and Australia over the last decade, that, we had this discussion at our advisory board and we said, do you think an audience would be interested in corporate reputation? And everyone said, yes. So that's what we're here for. So I guess the first question is, what do we mean by corporate reputation? And I guess there are, about 3 questions here. What is it? What does it mean to a corporation? Why does it matter? Everyone assumes it does matter, but why does it matter? And, how does it matter in law? What's the connection between law and reputation? So anyone that wants to dive in can just signal that they want to dive in. Who wants to start? Do you want to kick off?
It's the low-hanging fruit, so I leave the
low-hanging fruit
to and come out into it. So I guess reputation for our purposes, just in broad terms, is the sum of what all your stakeholders, your investors, your employees, your suppliers, your customers, think about you, think about your capabilities, think about your intentions, how trustworthy you are, how competent you are. People from outside the company cannot really tell what is the capabilities and intentions of the company. So they just look at the company's past behavior and figure out whether it's indicative of its future behavior or not, the company's communication, the company's performance in the past. So that is a
So it's very much, the image of the company to the outside world.
Yes.
Is that how you understand it, Ruth and Carmel?
Yes, it is. It's that external perception. So what's that collective view from the outside, and what creates that perception? So it's the actions of the company. It's how the leaders show up. It's how the communications are drafted. It's sort of the sum of the parts. And you're absolutely right, Roy. It's sort of intangible, but it really is a strategic asset of the company.
Sounds like part of the DNA of the company too. Ruth?
Yeah, I mean, my thoughts were very similar. It's the standing or perception of the corporation in the eyes of shareholders, major stakeholders, and the public generally. And it matters in the same way that reputation always matters, that ultimately most of us in most of life's endeavours, reputation is the most important thing, because at the point at which you stop trusting a person, be it a corporate person or an individual person, something of great value has been lost.
And hard to regain, but we'll look at how you might regain it. Roy, you've written about that kind of relationship between why does it matter for corporate law?
Yeah.
Do you want to say anything about how corporate law comes in sort of fostering or?
Yes. So to pick up from where Ruth left off, so this is reputation matters kind of both as a sword but also as a shield, in a sense that it could help you attract investors or secure favorable terms from lenders or charge premium prices for consumers. But then it could also help you buffer, crisis when crisis hit. And then the relationship with the law is that we can look at them as complements, in the sense that both the legal system and reputational concerns serve to motivate companies or to deter companies from misbehaving, whether out of fear of reputational fallout, you don't want to lose your reputation, or out of fear of paying a fine, you don't want to be subject to legal sanctions.
Yeah. I mean, you mentioned a range of stakeholders there, but you didn't mention employees, I don't think. And it's often thought that, if you've got a really ethical culture, that, young employees will be attracted to you.
So I think it dovetails with what you mentioned earlier after Carmel on the DNA. And to me, there's kind of a distinction between culture and reputation. Because like Carmel and Ruth said, reputation is towards the outside world, is external. And culture is kind of the way that things are done, but it's the inside view. So employees are inside the company. They can see, if you're the manager, if you're a director, they can see the kind of an example that he set and the economic incentives that they receive. And so they can understand, or they have a certain perception of your DNA. So that's the corporate culture.
I was thinking, though, before they become employees, that can attract them straight into the company.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So it's they're still at the outside. But I want to come back to that corporate culture point. So before we get into the fun stuff, which is, all the reputations that have been shredded in recent times, I'm interested just examples of good corporate reputation. What does good corporate reputation look like? And does it look different at different times in history or in different jurisdictions? So, I was thinking about 18th century England. A lot of the very well-known English companies that we know today, such as Cadbury's, Clark's Shoes, they started off as Quaker family companies, and they were absolutely committed to integrity, trust, the importance of confidence in financial dealings, discipline and responsibility. That was just part of their DNA because of the fact they were coming out of small groups of Quakers. I think of modern examples. I think of Tata in India. Ratan Tata was renowned for refusing to pay bribes, for absolutely saying my word is my bond. I don't need to sign contracts because I have never, breached my word. Now, that actually led to enormous problems when there was a succession to someone who was, more of a capitalist than Ratan Tata was. in Australia, I think, and I'd be interested whether, Rebecca and Carmel kind of think the same thing. I remember Lend-Lease. Now, that was started by Dick Dusseldorp, who came to Australia post-World War II. I think he'd been in a concentration camp. And he came and he started up a company that had a very different corporate model to the rest of the companies in Australia and was very employee focused. I doubt that Lend-Lease is as much like that now, but that was certainly the blueprint when he came to Australia. And he worked on the Snowy Mountain hydroelectric scheme in that really fundamental period when Australia was changing. So I think, Ruth or Carmel, and you can jump in if you've got any ideas on this, Roy, but what do you think of any particular companies or particular things you look for when you're assessing the reputation or the culture of the company?
I'm happy to start. I think one interesting thing when you look at companies that have got good reputations, it tends to be point in time. And there are some companies that did have a good reputation, they lost their reputation, they get it back. There are companies that have got a good reputation for something but not something else. And I'm thinking of, Apple on innovation, but is it good on other things? BHP is great on diversity and environment now, but was it always? And just thinking about, it's a very fluid concept, and certainly in the corporates I've been in, where we think about reputation, we think about it takes a long time to earn it. You go up the staircase to get the reputation, but you're down the escalator very, very quickly, and it's very expensive and slow to regain it. So I think in terms of companies, there was one instance, and it's a really old one, but it's the Johnson & Johnson back in the 80s where you might remember the Tylenol was laced with cyanide, and that was really damaging for their reputation. What they did, and this is often the way that companies continue to retain or can lose their reputation, it's how they then deal with the crisis. And what Johnson & Johnson did there was they recalled all of the tablets. They agreed to replace all of them, which at the time was hundreds of millions of dollars. And really, there was kind of a couple of month blip in their reputation, and it had been regained just because of the way that they proactively done it. And we've seen lots of examples of good companies with good reputations coming out of a crisis. So I find that quite interesting. I mean, there are companies like Bunnings, and what's that reputation? That reputation is customer service and being authentic. And so there are different elements such as
And of course, Coca-Cola, they had cocaine in Coca-Cola, but that didn't seem to really harm their reputation. Ruth, do you want to say anything on this?
I was trying to think today of companies that have had reasonably stable, good reputations over time, picking up, I think, Carmel's point about these things are often point in time, and came up with two, which is Lego and Rolex. And I was trying to think of what are the characteristics of firms that can sustain reputation over time. And those both struck me as different, but having some characteristics in common, which is that there's a very simple and clear brand narrative. There is a thing they do. They typically have happy customers. They have children wanting to buy Lego and people with disposable income wanting to buy blingy watches. But I think another aspect of it is it's related to essentially disposable income and not an essential service. And I think that once something is an essential or quasi-essential service, be it banking, be it health, be it telecommunications or the like, there is an emotional and visceral attachment and investment that people have that radically raise the stakes and make corporate reputation a slightly different and more fragile beast. So I think that might be an aspect, and we'll come to some of the companies that have had reputational damage. And I think an aspect of that is there's a particular sensitivity that attaches to them, and when they fail, the stakes are higher.
I think that's a really interesting point, and I think that point you made too, Carmel, about companies can have a good reputation like Amazon in terms of profitability, but in terms of, treatment of workers can be terrible. I think that fragmentation of reputation is also a really interesting point. you want to say anything, Roy, or are you happy to move on? Very happy to move on. I want to go back to the point that Roy was talking about when I mentioned employees, and he made that point, which I think is exactly right, that reputation is that projection to the external world, and culture is, within the company. And how is culture within the company established? Is it all tone at the top? Is it all Dick Dusseldorf at, Lend-Lease coming and saying, I've got a very stakeholder model of governance that's different to other Australian companies? Or are there other factors throughout the organisation that really play into that corporate culture issue? Roy and I have just written a paper together. That's how we know each other, really, because we wrote a paper together on corporate culture. So who wants to do this one?
I'm happy to make a few comments. I think it starts with tone from the top. You absolutely can't have a good culture if you don't have the right tone from the top, but that can't be enough. It's sort of everyone has a role to play. It's the small symbols every day. It's the alignment with values. It's a number of things. So it's not just tone from the top, but you can't have a good culture without tone from the top. It's the way you treat your employees. Is there a safe workplace to raise issues? It's the policies that you have in place, and that all goes to culture.
Yeah, I look back and I think of someone I wrote about very early in my career that threatened to sue me for defamation, Al Dunlap at Sunbeam. And, he was revered, and I do take it as a badge of honour that he threatened to sue me, but it was a bit worrying at the time. But there were a lot of those, narcissistic leaders in the US that were really revered. And yet now in Australia, I don't know that they would be. So there are clearly quite different cultural issues at play here of what that tone at the top should look like, because, those very dominant leaders were a big deal in America.
Yeah, if I can jump in. Listen. No, you go, Roy.
No, go ahead.
Just very briefly on that point, I was going to say something similar to you, Jennifer. The cult of the CEO can, I think, be a very dangerous tone from the top, be it Ken Lay at Enron, who starts as a hero and becomes a villain. Steve Jobs, who was probably always a hero in his lifetime, but creates a kind of culture vacuum because he is so significant. And I think I strongly agree with Carmel. You need dispersed power and dispersed values. And I think there's a real risk with hinging too much, even on a powerful and at times well-regarded CEO figure. Elon Musk is a currently powerful example of that.
Yes. And it's interesting because one of the ways in which historically US corporate governance has differed from UK and Australian is it is only very recently that the US has, encouraged having a separate, an independent chief, an independent chair. And I think that was because why would you want to fetter one of these, guru leaders? Whereas in the UK and Australia, it has always been that is good governance to have a counterweight to, unbridled power as the CEO. Do you agree with that?
No, absolutely. Kind of segues to the discussion of who inside the company should, care or oversee reputation. And just like you said, in the past, like in the 80s or in the 90s, it would treat the board as kind of a sounding board. There would not really be a check or a balance in that regard. But I guess nowadays, especially recent legal developments in the US, make the board of directors make its role in overseeing the reputation based Carmel and Ruth talked about much more important, because if there's a management pushing forward and cutting corners, reducing costs, that's their job. That's what we expect them to do. And then you have the board of directors in the oversight role saying, there's too much short-termism, slow down, think about the long-term reputation of the company.
And one of the really interesting things that came out of the discussion on Tuesday night, I felt, when Roy was talking about this trend towards specialist directors, which is global, and we had an Australian director there saying, this is very much a push by the AICD, etc. But one of the developments in that respect is that often you'll have these supermajority independent director boards, and that was the case in Sunbeam. That was why Al Dunlap threatened to sue me for defamation, because there were two executive directors who were guilty of fraud, and the independent directors didn't know enough to pick up on it. So there's this issue of, composition of the board, and that's really changed over time, and the size of boards has changed as well.
The boards will have a hard time dictating the culture. If you think about what Carmel said about how culture is being made on the ground. These are the unwritten norms of how we do things around here. And if the independent director, they come in for a meeting every other month or so, we won't be able to do much on culture. I think the board in its current 2025 mode, what we mentioned, specialist directors, these are directors that are not necessarily sunset CEOs in the 60s and the 70s. Someone has an expertise in technology and cyber, someone has an expertise in climate. They're much better positioned to monitor or to oversee reputation risk towards the outside, rather than change the culture. So what they can do with the culture is what you and Ruth talked about. Say there's a cut of CEO, and you think that management is pushing forward too much or cutting corners too much. This is where the board comes in, and as a result, will kind of protect the company's reputation.
Well, there's interesting literature at the moment in the finance realm which says that when you have more women on boards, that they are a valuable constraint on the overconfident CEO or the overconfident, usually male CEO. So, that's quite interesting. I don't know whether you feel you're holding them back all the time in your board roles, Carmel.
Not
sure she wants to.
Perhaps I won't comment. Maybe I will say, though, that it's a very, in my experience of US CEOs coming into Australia, there is a very different culture that they need to adjust to. And so some have had a success and some haven't. And when I mean success, had a negative or positive impact on the reputation of the company that they were leading.
Yep. So I think that question of the role of the board is a really interesting one, because maybe they can't, really. You said, Roy, well, when they're only coming into board meetings, 4 or 5 times a year, how can they get the information flow? That was something that came out of the Banking Royal Commission. How can directors get the information they need? It was interesting. I was at a business or council conference, which a number of people in the room were at a few months ago, and Nicola Wakefield Evans, who's a very prominent non-executive independent director in Australia, she said, I don't just go to board meetings. I insist on driving with the drivers, and that was actually how the fraud was discovered at Sunbeam, because the directors left the boardroom after Al Dunlap said he would resign if they'd pay him a fortune. They went and spoke to middle managers and said, is there any chance that fraud is occurring in this company? And all the middle managers said, yeah, duh, obviously. So, that thing of directors actually needing to kick the tires by not just being in the boardroom.
I think it's so important, because nowadays, and if Carmel can speak more to that, you have, in 2025, you already have in most of the large companies kind of a digital dashboards. So you're a director. It's not just that you're coming every 2 months and you're getting a PowerPoint presentation, few slides. You're getting it's accessible on your iPad or whatever. You're getting a dashboard of the company's performance on many, many metrics, and it's constantly being updated and so on and so forth. But that's it makes you think as if you know a lot. But if you don't talk to the drivers, you don't know the kind of things that we were talking about here. Those digital dashboards won't tell you that shenanigans are going on.
Yeah, that's right. And I think, Jennifer, coming back to your earlier question about why is reputation important to corporate law, with your director's hat on, directors have a duty to take, care and diligence, and that might mean, were they asking the right questions in relation to the thing that has become the reputational issue? And that might mean, even worse, if you're listed, should that have even been disclosed? So there is a really good reason why directors need to be sitting with the drivers or digging further than those tables as to what's reasonable in terms of care and diligence.
Ruth, have you got any comments on this one?
No, nothing further. Thanks.
Yeah. I would say now let us get to this point of how corporate reputation is lost and some examples of it being lost. And I know you've got many of those up your respective sleeves. So who's starting on this one? Do you want to start on this one, Ruth?
Sure, I'm happy to. So I think corporate reputation is lost, I think, fundamentally when trust is lost. And I think trust means different things for different corporations. I think egregiously bad behavior like deliberate lying will tend to substantially undermine corporate reputation. Volkswagen's a good example of that. That was just a pyramid of lies with lie upon lie. And a lot of the senior executives, including Winkelhorn, have now been imprisoned. I think a lack of candor or completeness in responding to a crisis can be very fatal for reputation. The Optus issue recently of drip feeding aspects of the dropout and such like was very bad for them. I think another, and this touches upon my essential services style point earlier, I think conduct that strikes at the heart of the service provided by the company can be particularly damaging. So there, for example, Boeing and safety. Anyone who understood what had happened in Boeing, just, I have a strong inclination towards Airbus planes now. Optus as a communications provider, not being able to select the right email address for the people within the Department of Communications in the government was I think very problematic for them. Whereas in a contrast, Qantas has had a series of difficulties recently, has not had a crisis that attacks the central part of what they do, which is keeping planes in the air. So I think conduct that really strikes at the heart of the service, and especially where that service is something that is prized. Honesty in banking is another example of that. And the last thing I would say is concurrent multifactorial failures. Optus is a good example of that. Star Casino is a good example of that. Companies that just have a lot of things going wrong at the same time, I think, can have a sort of fatal effect on corporate reputation.
Oh, Roy, you've written a lot on Boeing. So, yeah, tell us the Boeing story.
The Boeing story, just to backtrack for a second. So not all bad news is created equal. Okay, so we know that two companies can behave the same and they have the same product recall or financial restatement. One of them will emerge relatively unscathed, the other will maybe go bankrupt, I don't know. And there are many parameters. In general, in one word, it's indicativeness. Whether your stakeholders think that what happened in the past, the bad news, is indicative of your future behavior or not. That has many criteria that affect it. For example, if you go to Boeing and to airplane safety, I guess my favorite study of these things is from the late 90s. It's a study that examined how the stock market reacts, how the stock prices of airline companies react when there is an airplane crash. And the first finding of the study, and hold on to your seats, is that airplane crashes are bad for the stock prices. But the more important finding is that the stock price drops or not as a function, and that is pre-internet, pre-social media, 1980s, as a function of how the crash is being covered by the press or by the Wall Street Journal and in the morning after that. Again, pre-internet, okay? And they found that when the crash is being covered in terms of a maintenance problem or an error by the pilot, the stock prices completely crash. But when the crash, but when the crash is being covered in terms of like an unanticipated weather condition or mistake by the ground control in some airport, the stock price almost don't move. And the idea here is that if you have something that stakeholders perceive as a one-off bad luck, it could have happened to any other airplane company that was there in the sky at the moment, they don't punish the company. Because what if basically reputational fallout is someone saying, I'm not buying from you anymore? And if I don't have reason to think that it's indicative of your future behavior, if I'm punishing you, I'm punishing myself. Why shouldn't I, go on a Boeing 737 MAX anymore? Why should I even?
What about the nature of the misconduct? If it's misconduct rather than negligence, if it's for example, sexual misconduct by the CEO versus.
Right. So now we go back to what Ruth was saying, and I think if you go back to the example of the trip gig, it's basically if you feel that there is a complete lack of integrity, that kind of is indicative. If you feel that there is a corporate governance failure, and in Boeing they let the managers cut corners as part of this competition with Airbus. Bring a product to the market, don't say anything to the regulator, don't delay it, don't say anything to your customers even. So that's kind of indicativeness of a deep-seated culture or corporate governance failure where nobody's pressing the brakes and nobody's reporting to the board, or information doesn't flow, or the hotlines and the whistleblowing doesn't get elevated.
Wells Fargo, they just sacked all the whistleblowers, 5,300 of them or something.
Absolutely. And that is something which is super pervasive. The fact that you had 500 or 5,000 employees means that it's pervasive, that it's part of the culture. It means that it's indicative of future behavior. And so this will lead to a huge reputational fallout.
A couple of things coming to mind. First, the point that Ruth was making about this breach of trust and in the banking situation, selling to these customers and fees for no service, and PwC and that breach of trust with the government, and ANZ in just the last week or so with the record fine relating to breach of trust there with a government transaction and trading. And ANZ is a good example of something, Roy, you're saying, the different treatment of companies. I think reputation is more impacted if you haven't learned from mistakes of the past, whether they're yours or someone else's. So CBA hadn't learned from Tabcorp in money laundering. Westpac hadn't learned from CBA. Dar didn't learn from Crown. So each time, the reputational impact is worse if you haven't learned from the lessons of the past.
Well, I can't remember if it was Ruth or Carmel, but one of you made this point about how a number of the companies that had these real reputational hits had started off with stellar reputations for governance. And so I can think of, Sunbeam, Enron, and then after the global financial crisis, Wells Fargo, the US bank. Wells Fargo had been lauded for weathering the global financial crisis better than other banks in America. The CEO was named the Banker of the Year. And the bank was ranked among the top 10 most respected companies. So is it also a question of the higher they go, the harder they fall?
Yeah, there's a super important trade-off, and everybody in research and in reputation consultancy are trying to understand where the trade-off lands. Basically, there is a curse of expectation in a sense of man-bite-dog dynamics. If stakeholders expect more from you, then when something bad happens, there's more negative attention. It's more salient. You have it's a higher place to fall from. But on the other hand, there are also studies showing empirically that if you have a strong reputation prior to the bad things happening, you are receiving the benefit of the doubt, in a sense that your stakeholders will wait to see whether it was something which is one-off, whether it's a second, like a lower level rogue employee or something like that is not indicative of future behavior. But if it's something that goes to the core of your operations, or something that exposes, I think it goes to both what Pierce said and Carmel said, something that exposes hypocrisy. You communicated something else, you didn't, practice what you preach. This is when you have a huge fallout.
And that you may be thinking it's not just the reputation with whether customers will stay with you or employees are retained. It's also relevant in whether the litigation strategy, should we, bring a class action, or if you are in a court, is the penalty going to be perhaps lighter because they'll look at your good behaviour in the past, your good reputation in the past. So it's got a whole lot of which is a huge
in the US, in terms of,
If you think about companies in concentrated markets, and if you think about today's biggest companies, basically monopolies. So one of the biggest determinants of your reputational fallout or success is what the regulators think of you. And if the public thinks of you favorably, the regulator will not be quick to go after you. If the public thinks of you badly, if you're a monopoly, they won't be able to punish you as customers by switching elsewhere because there is no elsewhere. But the regulator is much more likely then to regulate you heavily and to go after you in enforcement actions.
I do find it interesting in a lot of these scandals or crises, whether it's kind of a different psychological dynamic, because I think of, the APRA inquiry into the CBA, which came before the Banking Royal Commission, and that was very much saying, look, everyone was just so excited about how profitable the bank was that they just lost sight of these non-financial risks. Whereas in the Banking Royal Commission, I had the sense it was more about compliance, nonchalance, that there was a certain arrogance rather than just, oh, this is all great, we're doing so well, aren't we, fabulous team. Because I think the APRA report almost talked about everybody worked so collegiately that they weren't questioning each other.
There was no constructive challenge.
Yeah. So I do think that that's quite interesting, those different psychological drivers that you see in some of these scandals. Now I wanted to talk to you briefly about something that's been a big issue in the US, and Steve Carruthers and another colleague of mine, Tim Bowley, we've got a paper that we're writing slowly on this issue. It's about corporations becoming involved in political action. And so, of course, Matteo Gatti in the US has written about this relatively recent trend in the US where you had a number of companies that were wading into issues such as gun control, LGBTQ rights, Black Lives Matter, and then we had the huge backlash with Trump. And so, the whole groundwork has changed there. But in some of these cases, the companies will take a political stance that seems to work fabulously well for their bottom line. So a recent example of that was this a supposedly, pro-Republican advertisement, Jean's ad of American Eagle, which featured Sydney Sweeney out of White Lotus. And apparently all the MAGA people just went out and immediately bought American Eagle jeans because they were so excited by this advertisement. On the other hand, you've got an example such as Bud Light a few years ago, which had an advertisement with Dylan Mulvaney, a transgender influencer, and that lost billions of dollars for the company in terms of consumer backlash. Now, some US commentators, such as Jill Fish and Jeff Schwartz, have said, the Bud Light example is just a really clear message that corporations should have nothing whatsoever to do with anything political, that they should just stay clear and do the only thing they were ever formed for, which is to make money for shareholders. Other people think, no, this is a form of democracy. And it's something we've seen in Australia too. The Woolworths backflip over, selling Australia Day merchandise, etc. So any views on that from my panel? Should corporations weigh into that? And how do you know whether it's going to be an upside to your reputation or it's going to lose you billions of dollars?
I'm happy to.
Yeah, you're in about and you're thinking about whether to weigh in cuddles.
I think that's probably being on reflection where many chairmen are here now saying that they wouldn't, but having been in boardrooms when it's been considered whether or not corporate should be involved in marriage equality or the voice, it's always easier with hindsight in deciding it. I think my view is the resources that you're using in support of something they're not the board's resources, they're the shareholders' resources. So unless you can actually look at your purpose and your values and your strategy, and you can say that we're supporting this because it's consistent with our purpose and values and strategy, then should we follow? So I think there's this fundamental threshold that I don't think is generally applied, but I think that's what you've got to apply when you're thinking about whether or not to weigh in. And so with some topics that your employees and your customers are 99% saying, yes, you should get behind, it might be an easier justification from a commercial, strategic and values perspective to support. If it's just because you want to hop on the bandwagon, or it's your employees and customers and other stakeholders are divided, I think it's very dangerous for companies to get involved.
Right. This point about being shareholders' resources brought to mind a story about Warren Buffett and Berkshire Hathaway in the 80s. So this is a story about corporate philanthropy, meaning corporate money that goes to charitable contribution. And Buffett was the first one that said, basically, it's shareholders' money. I'm not distributing it as dividends, so I will let shareholders decide to whom should we donate. And that's pre-internet. Now it's basically much easier. Right? So I will ask the shareholders in the proxy materials to say we want to donate it to fighting cancer or to poverty or to doing this or to doing that. And as a pro rata of the percentage of shares that they hold, we will donate the 1% of pre-tax income to these causes. And he did it 1 year, and then he stopped and he completely, put the kibosh on the corporate philanthropy. And the reason was that many shareholders voted for pro-life or, pro-choice organization. And there was a huge economic backlash.
Yeah.
How could Berkshire Hathaway donate to, pro-life, or how could Berkshire Hathaway donate to pro-choice? And
India, it's mandated that companies have to give 2% of their profits to charity, but it's very skewed where it goes to. So that philanthropy issue, I think, is,
If you think about it in context of what we're talking about, which is reputation, reputation is a relative construct, meaning you always judge as a benchmark to your peers, to your industry. If there is a law, if there is a regulation that requires that all companies will do X and all companies are doing X, or if on the other way around, the regulator is investigating all companies, then there are no reputational consequences, because it's not like consumers will switch from one company to another. The law applies equally to all companies.
Ruth, we haven't heard you on this issue. Do you want to say anything?
I think the criterion that Carmel identified is a really sound one. I think where one comes out, and this probably depends a little on whether implicitly you have a stakeholder or a shareholder conception of the best interests of the company. And I think it would depend on the company itself and whether it is of such significance and operating at such a scale that it's in the territory of a social license or social responsibility, where there is an expectation that something will be done. As I say, I liked Carmel's criterion a lot. I think there are forms of activity that are so universal and anodyne that they could probably be safely engaged in by anyone, irrespective of the nexus to their own corporate activities, child welfare, cancer research. There are certain things that would be so universally supported. But beyond that, I think an interesting example of this in the recent past was Qantas's support of the voice referendum. Qantas did have a history of supporting marriage equality and other things like that. But they went on a bit of an arc and then a dip in supporting the voice, of it being initially a good thing and then being frowned upon and being viewed as a waste of shareholder money. And I think it's again that point in time risk with all of these things, that something may be looked upon favourably at one point in time and then quite unfavourably at another.
Yeah. So different points of time can affect it, and different jurisdictions for sure, because I'm sure the US and Australia now have quite different societal values. Yeah. That really segues, I think, into another issue of ESG issues and reputation. And, when you were talking, Carmel, just about, the political action and reputation, you talked about employees and consumers. But, shareholders clearly come into the ESG issues. And we've got Luke Caparelli here somewhere from UniSuper, who's the ESG guy there. So, how does that play out now in America with the backlash against ESG? Like, I'm told you're not allowed to use the term ESG or DEI in America now. You're there in Boston, so you should know all of this, right?
Boston is not America.
And how do you find it playing out in Australia?
I don't know really how it plays out.
How does it play out in Israel? Tell us how it plays out in Israel.
That is very politically incorrect. You can say whatever you want, and I want you doing it. But I guess it connects to what you were just discussing, which is it's so hard for directors. It's kind of a damn if you do, damn if you don't environment. And it's so hard to predict, like Ruth said, what would be the public sentiment on issue X or issue Y. And for if we were talking about like legal liability, what a regulator would say, what the court would say, basically that's a business judgment that you can take, and you can say, I think that it's important because our employees support these issues, like Disney did with the Don't Say Gay proposals in Florida. And there is zero issue of legal liability here. The issue here is whether it's a smart business strategy or not. And I don't envy directors in that regard. In this environment, like you said, many of these companies are global. They need to have a certain reputation when they operate in Europe, and another reputation when they operate in Australia, and another when they operate in the US. So it's just maybe the hardest thing is to predict those changes in public sentiment over time. You know, politicians can do it, so why should?
I know Jeff Gordon in the US, he wants the E in ESG to be delinked from the S and the G because the environment is so important, but he thinks now the S and the G is dead. And you said there's no possible liability. I think that's true in the US. Noel Hutley and Sebastian Hutt for Davis have written memos that say it's certainly possible to have liability for breach of the duty of care for, climate change nonchalance in Australia. So that's another difference, I guess, between the US and Australia. Carmel or Ruth, anything on this? I mean, this was, a big issue, I think, in the Rio Tinto Juukan mines. That was a real hit to reputation based on ESG matters, I think.
Absolutely on that one. And it was a good example where institutional investors actually stepped in and said, you haven't done enough, Rio Tinto. Some people lost their pay, but really, I think in that case, they had a number of other options that they could have taken. They took the one that caused that terrible destruction. More needs to be done. And so it was a good example where I think institutional investors stepped in on a matter that they thought was, it's ESG, but it's so significant.
A real ethical issue because it was very much a collaborative institutional investor activist approach. And a lot of the UK institutional investors were church pension funds. And the US institutional investors they didn't care about it. But the Australian and the UK ones joined together and thought it was a real ethical disaster.
So just to tease out the distinction with what you were talking about right now. So the environmental stuff is the externalities, right? So that companies could make money by not investing in abatement or whatever, but it hurts the environment. And this is where we would expect gatekeepers or watchdogs like institutional investors to think about the market portfolio and the reputation risk at the industry level or the market level. On the employees or cybersecurity, these are things that are in the interest of the company. So management may not be able to or may not be willing to take good care of them because maybe they're short-termist, and investment in this reputation risk require long-term thinking. But in this case, we would think that the board or the management should be the one taking good care of it. With the E, I think you're completely right. With the environment, I think it's a good example. We probably need people from the outside, be it the regulator, be it institutional investors, or be it litigation.
One example before Ruth makes her comment. Even Woodside, so this Northwest Shelf, I was interested to hear the Australian Conservation Foundation, I think is the entity bringing an action to, I think it's the Human Rights Commission on the lawful. So there's been an approval from the government for expansion of the Northwest Shelf, the gas work happening up there. There's very strict controls around impact on Indigenous sites, but reputationally that has not been great for Woodside, and there are organisations, so not just institutional investors, but organisations that are willing to question that, and all of that is having an impact on Woodside's reputation.
There is a big difference between Australia and the US. In Australia, if you behave bad towards the environment, might be reputation risk at the company level. In the US, I'm not sure that that's the case.
Well, Rio Tinto was also lawful, but seen as improper. Ruth, anything?
I think ESG has been radically reshaped as a topic by recent political events. I think there's such a profound normative divide around the E now, including at the level of language prohibition, as you said, Jennifer, that it takes on a very different shape than it previously did. I think, as Roy said, the clearest gateway is obvious harm to the company. If there will be loss among shareholders, and that can be shown in a reasonably direct way. But I think the fact that this topic has become very fraught for boards shows the importance of institutional investors in agitating and being able to call out in a different way issues that might just become too vexed for boards in certain circumstances.
Yeah, I agree. And I do think that transnational element of collaboration between institutional investors is very powerful. But then on the other hand, you see, the MinRes scandal at the moment where the AFR recently accused the investors of investor Stockholm syndrome, that they could have acted more aggressively against Chris Ellison, but I guess that plays into what you say, if the money's been made. So they're perhaps fickle guardians. Now, look, how are we going for time? We could just talk forever on some of these issues. I want to race through because I really want the audience to have the opportunity to. How are you feeling, audience? Do you want to ask questions? Yes, they do. So we're going to just touch on a couple of other things. Oh, yes, financial press, royal commissions and community expectations have become increasingly important, particularly in Australia, I think. Would you agree with that, Ruth and Carmel? You've been involved in some of them. Do they really shift the societal feelings about these matters and corporate reputation? Go. Ruth, you go.
Sure. I think the saturation publicity that these kinds of things can get is a very significant factor in their effect on reputation. And I think the Royal Commission into banking in particular almost reconditioned, I personally believe, reconditioned the way the Australian public looks at corporate figures. I think there was a slightly unfortunate aspect of putting people in public stocks in the public square, and I think it changed in a way that I think is unhelpful, the discourse of law in a sense. I think we got accustomed to gotcha moments as opposed to sustained and rigorous cross-examination. So I think I think they perform a useful role, but I also think we have to guard against excessive zealotry in these things, because we need to hold people to account, and we need to do it in responsible and respectful ways. But we also still need to attract genuinely talented, responsible people to important corporate roles. And I think we have not quite got the balance right in Australia about that at the moment. And we really do have a revolving door of this week it's aviation, next week it's supermarkets, now it's telcos. And it's just all successors to the bankers who had to sit out their time in a courtroom in Melbourne for a number of months. So they play an important role, but I think we have to guard against a kind of destructive zealotry in that activity.
Just that if you think about the media in general, media is probably the most important institution in shaping corporate reputation. It flashes out information, so it gets the information out. It diffuses it so that it reaches a critical mass of stakeholders for it to matter. It certifies it, gives it credibility. It frames it in a certain way that then stakeholders decide whether it's relevant to me with my interactions with the company or not, but I want to stop buying from this company or not. But if you think about the things that we'll be discussing in this panel, and I'm curious if anyone here knows, and if not, just to think about it, how many financial journalists out there in Australia at the moment, given the state of the media in 2025? And my intuition is that if you take the number of actual financial journalists who are covering the market and the number of companies in the market, you will see that there is no way that the media will be able to cover in a good way, and the media scrutiny or discipline corporate behavior. It just doesn't work like that anymore in 2025, which is why the role of regulatory and commissions investigations or litigation becomes bigger, not just in the sense of the expected legal sanction for misbehavior, also very much so in the sense of telling us what happened, getting this information out there, certifying a certain version, framing a certain version, and in that way shaping corporate reputation.
Yeah, but one interesting thing in Australia is that a lot of these, the Royal Banking Commission only came about because of the financial press. It just kept, being in the financial press, and the government just had to act.
That is true, and I think that whilst I agree with Roy, there is that flip side that media can trigger regulatory investigations and royal commissions in a way and uncover things that maybe regulators don't have the resources or the time to do as quickly as a generalist. But it's not going to cover, you're right, Roy, all of it. But certainly it amplifies particular issues. And then on royal commissions, I'd agree with Ruth, and the reason I wanted Ruth to speak was I acknowledge the wonderful work that she did in the Royal Commission, just wonderful in the Banking Royal Commission, and it was hard. So it's that fine line between getting truth and accountability and being a bit of a people in stocks, which it sort of turned into. But it's not the only Royal Commission. I think there is there've been a number of Royal Commission into aged care and other things, which I think is holding industries and corporates accountable.
So if you're on a board and you get this terrible news, suddenly the information does come up to you, we're about to have a big scandal break, the press is going to be all over it, there's money laundering involved, there's sexual harassment throughout the organisation involved. Obviously, I guess psychologically, the first thing you want to do is just cover it up and play defence. But what works for a board that is in that terrible situation, and what doesn't work in your experience?
This is where it becomes legal. This is where fiduciary duties kick in. Because if you go back to the Boeing example, basically the court thought that the directors there could be held liable for breaching their oversight duties because of what happened after the first crash and before the second crash of the 737 MAX. So after the first crash, they did a quick, I think it was a Zoom meeting or whatever, and they discussed, the minutes show that they discussed our PR strategies. Okay? What will be the framing what will be the spin that we're putting on it in the newspapers? Basically, the spin was to say that it was because these are pilots, these are not American pilots, this would never happen for American pilots. And
bad apples.
A few bad apples. And the court said, your job here is to get to the bottom of it. What was the problem? Was there a safety problem? Why did it happen? Your job here is not just to go along with the CEO and accept whatever he's saying uncritically, because he's thinking X and you need to think more broadly than X. And this is where you might be in breach of your fiduciary duties. You're the organ, I think Carmel said it in the first 5 minutes, you're the organ in the company in charge of risk oversight. Reputational risks, Ruth said it in the beginning, is probably the most important risk. Now you have this duty to oversee. You don't need to manage the risk. You're not an expert in risk management, but you need to oversee the risk, and you need to make sure that you get bottom. Yeah.
I'm thinking if you're a board and you become aware of reputational issues, the last thing you do is try to cover it up. I think your bias is to action. You've got to act swiftly and you've got to communicate. The communication becomes the most important thing in terms of reputation. And by that, I don't mean go out and say everything, but you need to say something generally, and you need to be thinking about, what do I know? What are the known facts at this point? And what, if I put myself in stakeholders' shoes, what do they need to know? And that's why it is still quite extraordinary that it took that almost 48 hours for the 000 information to be communicated in the way it was at Optus. So I think that's also possibly not being prepared for crisis, because you can lose your reputation, as I said earlier, by the way you manage a crisis. So no, you've got to have swiftly, you need to get the facts, say what you can say factually, don't finger point, don't cover up, don't try and deny. You know, there's a lot of that deny, and then you have to come back out, particularly if you're listed, because if you have said something that turns out to be incorrect, you're going to have to go back out to the market. And not only is the reputational impact going to be severe, the share price and regulatory consequence will be severe as well.
Ruth?
I agree. I mean, I think find out the facts, act quickly, and be honest. And I think it's good to remember that the norms of trust are very basic. I currently have a 4-year-old, Jennifer, as you did when you were running around the Metropolitan Museum talking to Professor Baxt. And we say to small people, I don't really care what you've done. I care that you tell me. And we mean it, because it's once someone's lied to you, it's not that they've lied to you, it's that you can no longer trust them. And it's really very basic. And I think boards, just getting a handle on, of course, you wouldn't speak until you knew enough to speak. But at some point, even if you don't know everything, you have to speak in order to show, as Carmel was saying, that you're not completely asleep at the wheel and you have some sort of sophistication around communication. So I think these things are both extremely complex and very simple. And people want to be told what's happening.
It is important, but then in terms of, I guess boards think, what can we get away with? Can we just dock $4 million of pay of the executives at Rio Tinto? Will that be enough? Well, it wasn't enough for the institutional investors. Can we set up a board committee to examine it? Can we outsource it to a law firm that we're mates with to consider it? For me, the gold standard of, response to a reputational hit was the Siemens bribery scandal, where they basically offered amnesty to all whistleblowers for a month or something. And like a huge number of whistleblowers in the company came forward to say what was really going on. And, and then they just cleared the decks. That's the real clean the house kind of approach, right?
So going back to Ruth's 4-year-old example and falling into the tunnel, I was, like you said, I was consulting to a reputation consulting company, and back then the major issue was cyber attacks, and everybody thought if your company would be subject to a cyber breach, that's a huge reputational risk, and we learned that it's not. The reputational fallout down, because nowadays everybody assumes that all the companies will be attacked all the time. It's just a matter of when, not whether they will be attacked, and when, not whether there will be a breach. And we saw that the difference in reputational fallout is just a matter of what Ruth said, whether you cover it up or not, or whether you're being honest about it or not. And that's the board of directors. The controlling shareholder would try to convince you, or the CEO would try to convince you, let's cover it up, let's wait, let's report it together with the third quarter earnings or whatever. And if you're being honest about it, then stakeholders think this is not indicative of who the company is, because the company is a victim here. Yeah. Every company is going to be hacked. So it's just a matter of...
Well, the companies always say this is not who we are. So you have to figure out if it is who they are or that it's not who they are. I want to open it up now. If anybody in the audience does have questions. Steve,
sure.
Do you have a question?
Will you take the...
That'd be brilliant.
Speaking to this, so you direct me and I'll...
well,
let's see.
There's a question, Duncan, our colleague Duncan Wallace.
I was just wondering if you could make some comments on greenwashing and reputation laundering. And I thought it was interesting that Cole mentioned Woodside. Woodside has partnerships with Monash and sponsors a building in Monash, and it's alleged that it's trying to use Monash to launder its reputation. So if you had some comments on greenwashing and yeah.
Sorry, were you asking whether, as generally?
Yeah, just if you guys had comments on greenwashing and reputation laundering.
Simply greenwashing is a focus of, well, not just actors, but regulators. A couple of the comments that we've made, greenwashing is really just exaggerating something that you don't have a basis for saying. And there's a whole range of those things in relation to companies that have lost reputation about it. Some of it's not intentional. It's aspirational and it can be misconstrued. Others are deliberately trying to get an advantage from making a claim about environmental criteria that they are living by. I'm not sure that's answering your question, but that greenwashing is something that does have, I think, and continues to have, notwithstanding what we talked about in ESG, it's up there on one of the key risks that certainly the boards that I've worked with look at in everything that we say in terms of ESG. So I think it's important. I don't think I know you mentioned Woodside. Were you just using that as that? Because I don't think.
Yeah, I was looking as an example.
I think it's I think Woodside is a good organisation, and the reference to them and the gas project was really what can be approved and acceptable by some stakeholders is not acceptable by other stakeholders. And so reputation in relation to the same element can be different depending on who the stakeholder is in relation to one entity, which I think is quite interesting as well.
That's exactly what I wanted to say in general about not speaking about Australia because I don't know enough the details and the nuance, but there's a difference between the kind of what we discussed earlier, the curse of expectations, where there are companies with sensitive to reputation or very good reputation, and then everything that they say that doesn't live up to the promise could lead to certain things. And from my experience, at least in the US and elsewhere, the major polluters who donate to environmental academic schools, these donations do not really serve the purpose of boosting your reputation with your consumers because your consumers know that you're a major polluter. That's not why they buy from you. It's usually for preserving a certain face with the regulators or the media, just to be on the good side of the community, of the mayor, So these are usually the reasons why those major polluters donate to these like buildings or things like that. There's a difference between that and the good companies where the curse of expectation is coming in.
And that fragmentation of how particular matter might be viewed. That you talked about organisational hypocrisy earlier, I think, Roy, and I think maybe there are degrees of organisational hypocrisy.
Yeah, and I mean, I think what Carmel said is true. I think there are some aspirational claims that are not deliberately made and made, in fact, to be trying to be achieved, which are nonetheless not perfectly accurate. And there are some companies engaging in deliberate misstatement about their green achievements. I mean, I think in the latter category, that strikes me as a spectacular and second-order feeling of reputation to lie about something in order to build a good reputation. It was like a pretty spectacular failure. But I think a lot of these are more mundane and it's aspirational overstatement.
Yeah, can you just? Hello, Jeannie Patterson from Harvard Law School.
Thank you. So thank you guys so much. What a great panel! It's been really fascinating. And I was a little bit late, sorry. And I was really interested in kind of what I've heard is sort of this matrix of factors that might be relevant to reputation. So I thought that's really interesting. How close is it to the essential service you provide? Planes falling out of air. I think safety is another one. Is it safety or is it something else? So we might say safety of workers is something that probably gets underrated compared to safety of airline passengers. Financial press, how quickly you own up, what your previous reputation was, all of that. You may or may not want to comment, but I just wondered how you go about applying that matrix to consulting companies who sort of have had a bad run recently, but that seems to have done not very much for the continual use of them by governments and indeed their reputation.
Yeah. So there's a book by Yale professor Jonathan Macy from like 10 years ago that's called The Death of Corporate Reputation. And there he focuses on Goldman Sachs and Merit. And the idea, which is kind of similar, is that in certain industries, everybody got a bad rap and they're still making a lot of money. And the reason is that if everybody's got a bad rap, nobody has to fear that customers will flee from that. Or, I know that Goldman Sachs are kind of cutthroat, but I want these cutthroat consultants or underwriters to be on my side rather than on the side of other people. And I think it's the same with consultant firms. It's not like you can name and say, this consultant firm was a management consulting firm is great and has fantastic reputation and it's much better than McKinsey, and McKinsey are the bad guys and these are the good guys. You won't be able to say it. And once you won't be able to say that the entire industry has the same reputation, then most of what will deter them or motivate them will be like regulatory enforcement actions or litigations or things like that.
But Jonathan Macy, just thought that regulation was the problem and that everybody had to go back to, being ethical. It's a bit like Colin Mayer thinks if everyone has a, corporate purpose that they'll be ethical.
So we disagree with both of them. On this, you and I did, but
Yeah. I might pass, given my board role on one of those organisations.
Any more questions? One over here. Thanks, Steve.
Make this better.
Working? Said Naomi. Hi, Jen. Hello. Hi, Naomi. This is one of my students from Prato. Thanks for coming.
Did the voice thing?
I'm sure.
I don't think it's on.
That's okay. I can amplify my voice. No, because
We're recording.
Oh, it could be recorded. Oh,
I'll just do some more. It's fine.
let me go now. Sorry about that. Hi, yes, my name's Naomi. It's a pleasure to meet you all, and thank you very much for this invitation. I feel like just from this conversation, listening to you all alone, I've really learned so much and refined so much of what I've learned from Jennifer. I guess I have a question for Roy. When you were specifying how nowadays in 2025 media, how the proportion or disproportion of media journalists compared to how concentrated right now, how there's so many companies, and you're really emphasizing this distinction between, especially now and 2025, it kind of raised this idea that now in our age of technology, information is running wild. Everyone is saying one thing, whether it's one person with an Instagram account with a large following or a big organization or a journal article organization. I guess my question is, do you think that now in our age of 2025 with potentially over stimulation of information, do you believe that it's harder for media journalists to adequately convey what is actually going on in companies? Do you believe that nowadays with all the information that's going around, it's potentially harder for them to adequately express what's actually going on? And was it easier before 2025, do you believe?
no, it wasn't. And it's there's simply less of them now relative to, just like you said, the bombardment of information. And then we're back at the previous question, which is only matters of huge public saliency, like airplanes falling from the sky or very large companies, will receive that public attention. And there will be a lot of things going on, like, page 5 in Google search results is where information go to die. First, there was a company that's called Reputation.com in the first tech, and they reached $1 billion. And their entire business model was they protect your reputation. If there's something bad that happened with you, so how do they do it? What do they do? They will just bombard the internet with a lot of fluff information that will push the bad information to page 4, page 5 in the Google search results, and then no one will ever see it when they search you because they were just looking at the at the top result. So to answer, yes, absolutely. There's much less likelihood, given what you're saying, of this overwhelming information environment, that things aside from the most salient aspects will be covered.
Unless you're at a Coldplay concert.
And that's the virality of it.
Well, just today, I saw in the New York Times, Elon Musk is, fighting his to get his $125 billion, remuneration in the Delaware Supreme Court. $125 billion. So there's
Get the new one that, if it will be approved, will go to trillion.
yeah.
But that's going forward.
Yeah. No, that's we're not there yet. That that level of control by someone that owns X. Yeah. We've got another question.
And Jeff Bezos is Washington Post, and basically every
Hi, thank you very much. My name is Sam Blashke. I'm a barrister. And my question is about innovation, and in particular, the tension that there may be between pursuing innovation and protecting reputation. So the case study I'm thinking of is the difference between the way that Apple and, say, ChatGPT have approached generative AI over the last couple of years. Apple have a lot to lose, and so have been very careful and slow-moving, whereas ChatGPT as a startup have just thrown things out there and taken hits to reputation in exchange for moving fast and making a name. And so I'm wondering if members of the panel have thoughts on whether corporates should or do have frameworks for how to make decisions when you know there's a potential reputational risk.
So I need to think about it more. The way my intuition was that reputation and innovation kind of go together because both require long-term thinking. You may need to sacrifice some profits at the short term because you're thinking about the long term, protecting your long-term reputation. And innovation is also investing in R&D now, reaping the benefits in the long run. What you're saying about Apple and OpenAI, I'm not sure that's about reputation. You know, companies become big, there are certain structures, we work in a certain way, you won't get the same major breakthroughs. And to the extent that they're afraid, I think that they're afraid because they're more regulated than these small entrants, which is kind of a good thing. But I have to think about it more about whether worrying about the reputation is the reason that they didn't innovate. My intuition is no, but I will go with it home and I'll think about it.
Hello, Ruth. Got any questions or points to make about innovation and reputation? I mean, I find it interesting that everyone in the world knows about ChatGPT, whereas I think Claude is a much better AI model and, not very many people know about it.
Careful, it's recorded.
Oh, so it is. Yeah. Maybe we won't have the Q&A if you have recorded. Yeah. Another question, Caroline, over here.
Hi, Carolyn Lynchwood. My question for the panel is, what would you do if you were Stephen Rue? Because, as you know, Stephen Rue, the newish CEO of Optus, he's been brought in the wake of the 2022 data breach, which impacted half the Australian adult population. Then there was the mis-selling case, which the ACCC has recently settled for around $100 million, selling products to vulnerable customers that they didn't want or need, including a lot of Indigenous customers. Then we've also had, the first outage, again, a national outage impacting customers, businesses, emergency services, 000 across the nation. Stephen's come in, now we've had another outage. So what would you advise Stephen to do about corporate reputation?
I do feel sorry for Stephen Rue, who is a very good person, actually, and he has come in to, fix things. I feel that, coming back to the point I made earlier, I still don't understand why it took that long to come out and that the communication was to an email address that didn't exist. For going back to Ruth's point, this is a core service that's needed for life-saving calls. So there's something that should have been done more quickly, even if you didn't know all the facts, I think. So, but you can only, so there's been a mistake. How do you fix the misstep or mitigate the reputational impact? I think it's, you have to come out, you have to apologise, you have to be authentic, you need to be transparent. What's the steps that are going to be taken, the time frame in which you're going to update the public in relation to this. So I think while would be advising is that was a really bad misstep in the context of all the other missteps of the company to date. So there's little tolerance for missteps. But going forward, I would just be being really owning it. So I think having the CEO take responsibility and visibility and being the one making the communications is important, shows accountability, and just being as transparent as possible going forward with all the steps that are going to be taken.
Ruth, anything?
I think he's in a very, very difficult position, and you cannot but feel for him. I think I fundamentally agree with Carmel. Sincere accountability for the past and a full appreciation of what that entails, and a proactive and persuasive program for the future.
Well, okay. We will have one quick more question, and then we're going to go and have drinks and a bit of networking. Thanks, Steve.
Thank you.
Thanks, Ray. Ray Finkelstein.
2 questions just to finish off. I'm interested to know what sort of structural mechanisms, if any, can a large corporation put in place to avoid the kind of missteps you've been talking about and that we've seen happen in real life. And I wonder whether one external mechanism, this is really a second question, is if regulators see misbehaviour, instead of prosecuting the corporation, they prosecute the individuals involved, because misconduct is by people, not by corporations. And I wonder whether the regulator gets it wrong by avoiding attacking those are responsible for misconduct, which can destroy or diminish reputation.
So that's a perfect question, because Jennifer and I just wrote a paper about it.
On it, we'll send it to you.
Called Accountability for Flawed Corporate Culture, where the entire discussion is what the legal system is to do in that regard. And when regulators go after companies, usually the incentives of both sides is to settle quickly. So the regulators can say, I'm chalking a quick win. I brought up an enforcement action, I collected money, and the company writes it off as a small cost of doing business. No information comes out. To use the Facebook example, now there's a derivative action against, in the name of Facebook, against Zuckerberg. They were caught in some serious privacy violation for the opt-in time, and the FTC, the American regulator, opened an enforcement action. And the allegation is that the FTC said, you're going to have to pay $3 billion. And then Facebook said, okay, we'll pay 5. I said, why? As long as you don't go after Zuckerberg and Sheryl Sandberg and so on and so forth. And so it doesn't work that way when you go after the companies. Now, the question is, if you want to go after the individuals, whether you do so, whether you prosecute them in a criminal channel. And that's usually not the answer as well, because the settled concept in criminal law, you have to show that they knew, you have to show mens rea. In large corporations, by definition, even if you're the best director, you're publicly spirited, you're expert, you're not going to know 90% of the things that happen. If the information wasn't brought out to you, you're not going to know about it. And so it will be very hard to prosecute you criminally. So what Jennifer and I talked about was more of the kind of a civil law, corporate law, securities law channels, whether in Australia by the regulator, public enforcement model of corporate law, or whether in the US, kind of a bounty hunting, private litigation model of the plaintiff's bar bringing in derivative actions. And I think just like your intuition, that channel affects reputation, not necessarily by the outcome at the end of the case, by the mere fact that you have discovery and you extract information and you know what they knew and what they didn't know. That goes to your first question. Did you have systems monitoring information and elevating information to the top? Whistleblowing from inside the company. Did you hear about it in real time? What did you do about it in real time? So that kind of law enforcement as a channel for producing information on how companies protected their reputation.
It's interesting, though, because the US regulators have been criticised for always going after the company and then settling with them.
That's right.
Whereas in the Banking Royal Commission, I think Commissioner Hayne criticised the regulators for going after low-level individuals and not going after the banks or senior people.
So going after low-level employees will make things worse.
Oh,
Because
exactly.
now it's the incentives of those at the top, those that set the tone at the top, is their incentives to remain usually blind.
Yeah.
As long as I can say that I didn't know and everybody's scapegoating, scapegoating the lower-level employees. Then.
Yeah.
The only thing I would add in terms of what structures you could put in place, I have seen KPIs for everyone in an organisation linked to reputation. And so that gets, everyone focused on reputation and everyone penalised for reputation. So it's not the litigation route, but it certainly focuses the mind and joint accountability.
But that's reflected in their pay?
Yes.
Yeah. Ruth, anything to finish off here?
I think Roy and Carmel have given perfect answers to the perfect question, and I have nothing to add.
It's just we're going to go and do some networking now. I just want to say, if you are interested in more horror stories about corporations, Claire Hill from University of Minnesota is visiting next week. She is giving a seminar on anti-social business models on the 22nd of October. It's up on the CLARS website. Please join our mailing list if you're not already on it. And then in November, on November 20th, Curtis Milhopt, who is a professor from Stanford Law School and one of the most eminent corporate governance scholars, particularly in the Asia Pacific region, he is going to be talking about geoeconomic risks in the world at the moment. And John Thwaites, who is at Monash University, will be the commentator for that. We haven't got that up on the website yet, but I think there will be an invitation going out on our mailing list. So please join our mailing list. Herbert Smith Freehills Kramer, Rebecca, all your colleagues, thank you so much for hosting this. Ruth, thank you for being here. And everybody, please introduce yourself to Ruth during the networking event. And you'll be deluged. Okay, she looks like don't do that. Please go and grab a drink and we'll chat some more. And I'm sorry we don't have any here, Ruth, to have a drink with you, but you have a good night. Thank you.